Hey guys, welcome to your next project. So I actually really like this project. I think it's really cool looking. So basically we just have a simple article. This could be anything at all, any website, any blog, whatever. And up here we have the little navigation icon. If I click this, what's going to happen is it actually rotates the entire website, the entire container here. And then it brings in the nav here, the navigation items from the side, and the icon also changes. So basically we have two icons, open and close. We're going to position them so that when we click it, this circle. All right, so we're going to get started here. All right, so we need to finish up our CSS. We have to deal with the actual nav down here. But before we do that, I'm just going to add a couple more content styles. So for the content itself, let's do a max width of 1000 pixels, and we'll set margin. Let's do 50 pixels on the top and bottom, auto on the left and right. Keep it in the middle, so even if we stretch it out, you know, it's going to have a 1000 pixel width max. And then for the H1, say content H1. We're just going to take the margin away from that, so margin 0. And then for the small tag, for the author, let's set a color of 555, and let's set a font style of italic. And then for the paragraphs, so content paragraph, we're going to set color to 333, and let's increase the line height to 1.5. And we already have the image at 100% width. Good. So now we just need to really deal with the navigation, which is right now is down here. And what I want to do, since we're only going to see this when this actually rotates, when we click this, I'm going to add the show nav. So show dash nav. I'm going to manually add it for now, and then the actual navigation, we want that to be positioned over here, right? So let's do this above where we did the content stuff, and I'm just going to use the nav tag as a selector, and I want to position this to be fixed, because we want it fixed down to the bottom. So we'll say fixed and bring it from the bottom 40 pixels up, and from the left 0. So that puts it, you know, near where we're actually going to want it. And then I'm just going to set a high Z index here, so it's on top. Let's do a Z index of 100. And then for the UL, let's say nav unordered list, it's not class, just nav. So for that, let's do a margin, not a margin, let's do a list style type of none. So that will get rid of those bullet points. And then I'm gonna set padding left to 30 pixels. And then we wanna style the list items. So nav ul li. And I want them all uppercase, so let's do a text transform uppercase, and let's change the color to white, and let's set a margin of 40 pixels on the top and bottom, so we're really going to separate them from each other. And then let's bring it over here. We need to have it initially over here more to the left because it's going to come in as this rotates or right after it rotates. So to do that, we can use transform, and we want to translate on the x-axis. So translate x. We want to bring it left, so that would be negative. We'll do negative 100%. So if I save that, now you can see that it's, you know, it's way over here. We can still see it a little, but that's fine. It's just going to come in. But we want that to come in smoothly, so let's add a transition on that. So transition, the transform property, and we'll do a 0.4 second duration, and we'll use ease in here. And then let's see, for the, you know what, let's comment this out for a minute just so we can actually see this. I want I want some more space between the icons, so let's do nav ul lii, and I'm going to set the font size, let's do 20 pixels, and let's set margin right to 10 pixels. Oops. Okay, so it makes the icon a little bigger, also put some space in between them. Now, we're going to want each one of these to stick out a little more, kind of going at an angle. So what we can do is take the nav, let's say nav ul li, and then the direct li after that. And let's add a margin left of 15 pixels. So if I save that, what happens is the LIs after the initial LI are going to stick out 15 pixels. Now I want this last one to stick out even more, so what I'll do is take take this, copy it, and let's say li plus li plus li. So basically anything after, you know, this one here. So the contact one, I want to stick out double that, so 30 pixels. So now you can see that it's at an angle, kind of at the same angle as the pages here. So we have initially we have this negative 100% translate X. So if I uncomment that, it goes almost off the screen, but we're going to want these ones to initially start out more over as well to the left. So I'm going to copy that, and for this one here where we have our margin left 15, let's do negative 150%, and then for this one here, let's do negative 200%, because we need those to be over more. Now, when we have the show nav applied, we want it to actually show the navigation. Everything we just did is the default when you first come to the page. When this class is actually there, which it is now because we manually added it, we want to see all the navigation stuff. So let's go. We want to do this. We'll go right above the nav here, and let's say, so the container div, when it has show dash nav, then we want to take the direct navigation LIs after that, and we want to bring them into view. So let's set transform translate X on all of those to 0, which is going to bring it to its, you know, its original place. And I want to add a little bit of a delay, so we'll say transition delay. Spell that right? Transition delay. I'm going to set that to 0.3 seconds so that it comes in, you know, a little bit after. Oops, I forgot my semicolon. So it comes in a little bit after the rotation. So now we're able to see it because we have that show nav. So if we take this off, then we just have, you know, just looks normal. And then if we have it, you can see it rotates and it shows the navigation. Now we want to have the functionality where we click this, then it adds that class, which is going to be pretty easy. So let's jump into our script here, and let's create a variable called open, and we'll use document.getElementByD. we have an ID of open. We also have an ID of close. So close, and then we also want to grab the container. So const container, get element by ID. Actually, no, that's a class. So let's do, I mean, you could add an ID, or you could just use query selector. And we want dot container, it's a class. All right, so let's take open and let's add an event listener to that. So we want to listen for a click, and when that happens, we're going to run an arrow function, and then we just want to take the container, and from the class list we want to add the class of show dash nav, and then close is going to be similar, so I'm just going to copy that, and let's change this to close, and then let's do container class list remove. All right, so if I save that and I click, okay, so that happens. So let me just reload. So I click, and that rotates, these shoot in, but we can't see the close here. So to handle that, let's go back to our CSS. And we basically just want the circle, this to rotate when there's that show nav class. So I'll go right below the circle. So let's say circle and dot show nav. And then we're not actually I'm sorry, not circle, container. So when the container has show nav applied to it, then we want to style the circle. And what we want to do with the circle is rotate it. So let's say transform rotate, and we're going to rotate it -70 degrees. Okay, so now once it rotates, we can see the close button. just because of where it's positioned. When this circle rotates, it just comes into view. All right, so that looks pretty good. So not too bad. I mean, we're just adding and removing a class, and we're setting certain styles on the circle and on the navigation, when we have that class applied. So you could use this on with any website, any application. So that's it. Let's go on to the next video, next project. Okay, so this is going to be one of the shortest projects in this course, but it's a cool little widget that you can add to your website or to your application. It's a hidden search, and we just have this button here with a little search icon from Font Awesome, and as soon as I click it, it fires off a JavaScript event that activates a specific class where we add a transition for the width of this input to get wider and the button to move over using a transform translate X. And if I click it again, it's going to shrink back up. Okay, so we'll be using CSS transitions along with just a little bit of JavaScript to add the event and toggle the class. All right, so let's get started. All right, we're going to get started on our hidden search forms. So in our HTML here, I have my project starter. You can also see I have the font awesome link here because we're going to be using the search icon for the button. So let's change this to hidden search. And then down here in the body, let's create a div with the class of search. And this div is going to wrap both the input and the button. That's really all we have. So let's add the input. I'm going to give this we'll give this a class of input. And the type is going to be text. Let's also add a placeholder. So placeholder will just be search ... And then right after the input, we'll have the button, and the button is going to have a class of btn, and inside that button we'll have an I tag with the font awesome icon, so FAS, and FA-search for the icon. So if I save it, we're going to see this, just a regular looking ugly search form. So let's jump into our CSS. Basically what we want to do is have a class of active, and when it's active, the input here will expand and the button will move over, and we want it to start with just showing the button. So let's just get some general styles in here first. As far as the body goes, I want to add a background. Let's say background image, and I'm going to use a linear gradient. So we'll say linear gradient. Let's do a 90-degree gradient, and for colors we'll do the hexadecimal value of 7D5FFF, and let's do hexadecimal 7158E2. Okay, so those are going to be our colors, and we need to put a semicolon. Here that I forgot. Where am I? Where's my cursor? Okay, so now we have that background gradient. You can probably make this a little smaller here. Okay, that's our background. Now we want to display flex, align everything to the center. We don't need where is it? Flex direction as a column. Height 100 viewports, good. The search class, I'm gonna position this relative so we can position things inside of it absolute, and let's set the initial height here to 50 pixels. And then for the input, that has a class of input. Actually, let's do search input, and let's set a background color of white, and let's set a border of 0, take away any border, and I'm going to make the font size 18 pixels. We'll make that a little bigger, and let's set the padding on this to 15 pixels all around, and we'll set the height to 50 pixels, And let's set the width to 50 pixels. So it's going to start off short like this, but then we'll have an animation or a transition to expand it. So I want to add here a transition on the width property. Okay, so we want the width to have a transition that's going to last 0.3 seconds with an ease effect. Now for the button, let's style that. So that has a class of btn, and we're going to set a background color of white, and let's set a border of 0. We want the cursor to be a pointer when we hover over it. We want a font size of 24 pixels. So remember, this is the button with the icon, and I want to position this absolute within the within the search class here, search container. And let's say from the top 0 and from the left 0, and then we're gonna give this a height and a width of 50 pixels. Okay, so it puts it right in the middle there. And then I want to transition on this, because what we want to do with the button is move it over. We want the input to expand the width. We have the transition for that up here. The button we want to push over. Okay, so the input gets wider, the button gets pushed over. So we'll use transform on that. So we want to add a transition for transform, same amount of time as the width on the input, and an ease effect. Okay, and then we want to get rid of any outline. So let's grab, let's say, the BTN when it's in its focus state, and also the input when it's in its focus state. We want to set the outline to none. Okay, so now we don't see that outline. And then finally, we want to take the search input, but when it's active. So the search class, if it has an active class, then we want the input to go to 200 pixels from, what was it, 50? Yeah, so it starts at 50, and then when the search element has an active class on it, then the width will go to 200. And then we also want the button to move over. We have a transition on the transform, but we haven't actually created that yet. So also when the search has the class of active on it, then we want to take the button and we want to set transform, and we want to move it along the x-axis. We want to move it to the right, so we can use translate x. So translate on the x-axis, and we'll move it over 198 pixels. All right. So if I save that, we're not going to see any difference here because we need a little bit of JavaScript to be able to give it that class. And you'll see if I manually put on the active class here, there we go, it expands. So JavaScript is going to be really simple. Let's go ahead and bring in the search. So document dot query selector, and we want to grab the class of search, and then let's also grab the btn, and then let's grab the input, and then I'm going to take the button, and we want an event listener on that, so we want to add an event listener of a click event, and when we click, we're going to call an arrow function here, and all we want to do is take the search, remember the search div, which I just showed you. If I put an active class on that, it widens it out, pushes the button over. So that's what we want to do. We want to say from search, we have our class list, and then there's a method called toggle to toggle a class, basically just add and remove it. So we'll toggle the class of active. I also want to set focus on the input, which we can just use the focus method. All right, so if I go over here and I click, it not only opens it and pushes the button over, widens the input, but it also focuses in there. And if I click, it goes back. And you can see just from the projects we've done so far and some of the ones that we're going to do, a lot of this it's all just putting specific classes through our JavaScript, through events, clicking or hovering over something and making an event fire off where we just add or remove or toggle a class. And then we have a transition to give us a cool little animation. So there's very little need for something like jQuery to do stuff like this anymore. You just use vanilla JavaScript mixed with CSS, and you can do just about any kind of animation that you can do with jQuery pretty easily. Okay, so in this project, we're going to be building a blurry loading page or loading image. So if I come to this page here, you'll see that the image starts blurred, and we also start with 0%, and then that goes up to 100%, and the image comes into focus. So you could use this to load just about anything. We're just doing a blur effect on the image, but you could load in your site. You could have any other elements in the DOM load in that specific amount of time from when we go to 0 to 100. And we'll have to map different number ranges to the 0 to 100 load. For instance, the image blur is going to be 30 pixels when it starts, and it's going to go down to 0 as we go from 0 to 100. And there's a Stack Overflow function that we're going to use to help us do that, to help us map one number range to another. Ranges to, we go to 0 to 100. And we'll have to map different number ranges to the 0 to 100 load. For instance, the image blur is going to be 30 pixels when it starts, and it's going to go down to 0 as we go from 0 to 100. And there's a Stack Overflow function that we're going to use to help us do that, to help us map one number range to another. All right, so that's it. Let's get started. So we're going to get started on the blurry loading project, and the HTML is going to be really simple. There's actually only 2 lines in the body, but let's add a title here. So we'll call this blurry loading, and then down here let's get rid of the H1, and this is going to be a section. I'm going to give this a class of BG. So this is going to be the background image that we blur, and then we'll have around the text we'll have a class of loading dash text, and we just want to put in here 0%, and that should do it as far as the HTML goes. So let's jump into our style sheet, and there's not too much we have to do here either. I'm going to change the font, so I just want this to be googleapis.com/CSS, and we want to use a font family. I'm going to use a family of Ubuntu, if I can spell family correctly. And then let's change down here, change Roboto to Ubuntu. And then this stuff can really all stay the same. We don't have to change anything here. We don't need flex direction column, but it's not going to hurt if you do leave it. Now for the background, remember we have that section with the class of BG, and we want to set a background. Actually, let's just use the background property and say we want this to be a URL, and the actual image that I'm going to use, I'm just going to copy and paste in. Of course, you can use any image you want. If you want to use this one, you can get it from the link from the repository. So let's make this have no repeat. Let's make it center on the X and Y axis, and cover for the background position. And we want to position this absolute. And then let's set the top. So I'm going to initially just set the top in left to 0. I'm going to change this, and I'll show you why in a couple minutes. And then the width, we'll set that to 100 viewport widths, and the height to 100 viewport height. So we just wanted to take up the whole viewport. And let's add a Z index here of -1, because we want this to be behind the 0%, or whatever the percentage is, the text. And we want to add a filter here, and initially the blur is going to be set to 0 pixels. And then for the loading text, we just want to increase the font size. Let's set that, we'll set the font size to 50 pixels, and let's set the color to white. Really depends on the background image you use. All right, so that gives us this. Now I just want to show you something. Because this is going to start blurry, and then it's going to make its way up, or make its way down, I should say. The higher the pixels for the blur, the more blurry it is. So if I put like 70 pixels, in here. That's what it looks like. Now, notice on the edges, this comes out quite a bit. So I actually want to fix that. I don't want it to come out that much. So for the top and left, I'm going to set that to -30 pixels. And let's also set the left to -30 pixels. Now if I do that, you're going to see there's less spacing on the left and the top, but there's more over here. So for the width and the height, what we can do is calculate. So we can use calc and just wrap this, and we just want to add 60 pixels like that, and now you can see that it's even on the left and right. We want to do the same for the top and bottom, so we'll do the same thing. We'll just calc, and we want to add 60 pixels here as well, and now there's not as much space. All right, so I think that that looks a little better. So let's put this back to 0 pixels. So in the next video, we want to add our JavaScript to 100 viewport height. So we just wanted to take up the whole viewport. And let's add a Z index here of -1 because we want this to be behind the 0% or whatever the percentage is, the text. And we want to add a filter here, and initially the blur is going to be set to 0 pixels, and then for the loading text we just want to increase the font size. Let's set that, we'll set the font size to 50 pixels, and let's set the color to white. Really depends on the background image you use. All right, so that gives us this. Now I just want to show you something. If because this is going to start blurry and then it's going to make its way up, or make its way down, I should say. The higher the pixels for the blur, the more blurry it is. So if I put like 70 pixels in here, that's what it looks like. Now notice on the edges, this comes out quite a bit. So I actually want to fix that. I don't want it to come out that much. So for the top and left, I'm going to set that to negative 30 pixels. And let's also set the left to negative 30 pixels. Now if I do that, you're going to see there's less spacing on the left and the top, but there's more over here. So for the width and the height, what we can do is calculate. So we can use calc and just wrap this, and we just want to add 60 pixels like that, and now you can see that it's even on the left and right. We want to do the same for the top and bottom, so we'll do the same thing. We'll just calc, and we want to add 60 pixels here as well. And now there's not as much space. All right, so I think that that looks a little better. So let's put this back to 0 pixels. For the top and bottom, so we'll do the same thing. We'll just calc, and we want to add 60 pixels here as well, and now there's not as much space. All right, so I think that that looks a little better. So let's put this back to 0 pixels. So in the next video, we want to add our JavaScript so that we can have this flex direction column, but it's not going to hurt if you do leave it. Now for the background, remember we have that section with the class of BG, and we want to set a background. Actually, let's just use the background property and say we want this to be a URL, and the actual image that I'm going to use, I'm just going to copy and paste in. Of course, you can use any image you want. If you want to use this one, you can get it from the link from the repository. So let's make this have no repeat. Let's make it center, center on the X and Y axis, and cover for the background position. And we want to position this absolute. And then let's set the top. So I'm going to initially just set the top in left to 0. I'm going to change this and I'll show you why in a couple minutes. And then the width, we'll set that to 100 viewport widths, and the height to 100 viewport height. So we just wanted to take up the whole viewport. And let's add a Z index here of -1 because we want this to be behind the 0% or whatever the percentage is, the text. And we want to add a filter here, and initially the blur is going to be set to 0 pixels. And then for the loading text, we just want to increase the font size. Let's set that, we'll set the font size to 50 pixels, and let's set the color to white. Really depends on the background image you use. All right, so that gives us this. Now I just want to show you something. Because this is going to start blurry and then it's going to make its way up, or make its way down, I should say. The higher the pixels for the blur, the more blurry it is. So if I put like 70 pixels in here, that's what it looks like. Now notice on the edges, this comes out quite a bit. So I actually want to fix that. I don't want it to come out that much. So for the top and left, I'm going to set that to -30 pixels. And let's also set the left to -30 pixels. Now if I do that, you're going to see there's less spacing on the left and the top, but there's more over here. So for the width and the height, what we can do is calculate. So we can use calc and just wrap this, and we just want to add 60 pixels like that, and now you can see that it's even on the left and right. We want to do the same for the top and bottom, so we'll do the same thing. We'll just calc and we want to add 60 pixels here as well, and now there's not as much space. All right, so I think that that looks a little better. So let's put this back to 0 pixels. So in the next video, we want to add our JavaScript so that we can have this image basically start blurry and then have it work its way up to being clear as this percentage loads here. I'm going to change -1, I should say that. That's what it looks like. Now, notice on the edges, this comes out quite a bit. So I actually want to fix that. I don't want it to come out that much. So for the top and left, I'm going to set that to -30 pixels. And let's also set the left to -30 pixels. Now, if I do that, you're going to see there's less spacing on the left and the top, but there's more over here. So for the width and the height, what we can do is calculate. So we can use calc and just wrap this, and we just want to add and have. So now we want to work on actually having this percentage change. So we want it to go from 0 to 100. And then the background image is going to start blurry, and then it's going to go to clear as this loads. So first thing, we'll just bring in the two elements we have, which are the load text. So let's say document dot query selector, query selector, and we have a class of text, or what we call loading text. And then we also want the background, so that has a class of BG, and we'll just call this BG. Okay, now I'm going to initialize a value here called load, which is going to start at 0. Obviously, it's going to go from 0 to 100. And we're going to have a function here called blurring. And right now, I just want to take that load value and increment it by 1. And then I'm going to go ahead and just console log load. Now, the way we want to run this function is in an interval, and I want it to run, and right now I just want to take that load value and increment it by 1. And then I'm going to go ahead and just console log load. Now, the way we want to run this function is in an interval, and I want it to run every 30 milliseconds. So let's create a variable here called int. So we'll say let int and set this to set interval. And the function we want to run this function is in an interval, and I want to start at 0. Obviously, it's going to go from 0 to 100, and we're going to have a function here called blurring. And right now, I just want to take that load value and increment it by 1, and then I'm going to go ahead and just console log load. Now, the way we want to run this function is in an interval, and I want it to run every 30 milliseconds. So let's create a variable here called int. So we'll say let int and set this to set interval. And the function we want to run is the blurring function, and let's say every 30 milliseconds. Okay, this is not 30 seconds, this is 30 milliseconds, which is very quick. So I'm going to save this, and if we go and we open up our DevTools here and we go to the console, you're going to see it's just going to go from 0, and it's going to increment every 30 milliseconds forever. It's just going to keep going. Obviously, we don't want that. We want it to go from 0 to 100. So what we'll do here, actually, I'll leave the console log for now, and let's say if the load value is greater than 99, then we want to stop that interval, and the way we do that is with the clear interval function. So we want to pass in int because that represents this set interval. So now if I save that, when it gets to 100, it should stop. Okay, so that's what we want. Now, instead of just console logging, obviously we have some stuff in the DOM that we want to work work with that we want to change. One is going to be the text. So let's take the load text and set the inner text value. And I'm going to set that to, let's use some template string here, and we want the load, okay, whatever that is at the time, and then just a percentage sign. So if I save that, you'll see that this will start counting up to 100. And also the way that I want this to show is not only count up to 100, but it's going to start fully opaque, and then it's going to start to fade out as it loads up. All right, so what we'll do is take the load text and set the opacity. So let's say style.opacity. .opacity. And this is going to be tricky because the opacity value isn't going to be the load value, because that goes from 0 to 100. Opacity goes from 0 to 1, right? So it's going to start at, or actually in our case we want it to start full, fully opaque, so 1, and we want it to go to 0. So we have to map a range of numbers that is basically 0 to 100 to going from 1 to 0 in the same amount of time. Now, there's actually a Stack Overflow post that we're going to use here to reference. And this person asks either in JavaScript or jQuery to map a range of numbers to another range of numbers, because that's what we want to do. We want to map 0 to 100 to 1 to 0 for the opacity. And this is the question here, but the answer that I want to show you is this one here. So it's pretty simple. It takes in a number, it takes in the minimum and the maximum of the in number, which in our case is going to be 0 and 100, so the load. And then outmin is going to be 1, opacity 1, and then outmax is going to be 0. Okay. Because we want it to go from solid to disappear. So I'm going to actually put this link here. I'm going to put this at the bottom of the file just in case you need to look at it. And then I'm going to grab this function here called scale, and we're going to put this right here. And then what we can do is when we're setting this opacity, we'll run it through scale, and we're going to pass in the number, which is load. So that's the amount of time that we want this stuff to happen. So when that goes from 0 to 100, we want to map opacity from 1 to 0. If we were starting invisible and going to opaque, then we would do 0, 1, but we're doing it the other way around. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's go to the page here, and I'm going to save, and this will run. And now you can see it's going to just slowly fade out as it gets closer to 100. All right, so this is actually a really handy little function. Let's put this, put this right up here so we know that goes with that. And Stack Overflow is great for little functions like this to do a specific task. Now we have to do the same thing for the blur, because I don't want the blur to be from 100 pixels. I want it to be 30. 30 is the max. So actually I'll just show you right here. If I set in the CSS, that's the max blur I want to do. I don't want to set this to 100 like that. So we have to map the 0 to 100 to 30 to 0, because we're going to start blurred. So we want to start at 30 pixels and bring it down to 0 when the load is done. So let's take the BG, the background, and let's take style. We want to do style dot filter, and we're going to set that to template literal, and let's say blur. And inside here, inside blur, we're going to open up our variable syntax or expression syntax, and we're going to call scale, and we want to scale the load just like we did with the opacity, and it's going to be from 0 to 100 for that load. And then we want the blur to go from 30 to 0 in that same amount of time that load goes from 0 to 100. So let's save that. And oh, I forgot pixels. So we have to have the number. You have to have px in here. So after this expression, we'll do px, and there we go. So now you can see that the background image is going to go from a blur of 30 pixels down to 0 in the same amount of time that the load goes from 0 to 100. Same thing with the opacity of the number. All right, so that's pretty much it. And inside here, blur, we're going to open up our variable syntax or expression syntax, and we're going to call scale, and we want to scale the load just like we did with the opacity, and it's going to be from 0 to 100 for that load. And then we want the blur to go from 30 to 0 in that same amount of time that load goes from 0 to 100. So let's save that. And oh, I forgot pixels. So we have to have the number. You have to have px in here. So after this expression, we'll do px, and there we go. So now you can see that the background image is going to go from a blur of 30 pixels down to 0 in the same amount of time. time that the load goes from 0 to 100. Same thing with the opacity of the number. All right, so that's pretty much it. And of course you could load in anything you want. I chose to do just an image and blur it in, but you could add other effects with stuff that you add to the HTML, that you add to the DOM. But that's it for this project. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. All right, so in this project, we're going to build a scroll animation, which is pretty simple. We can most likely do this all in one video. However, it's very useful. You might see these websites where you start scrolling and parts of the site, images or sections of the website start to come in. So I just created these content blocks, and you can see there's 3 to begin with. But if I go and I start to scroll down, the next one comes in from the left. Go down some more, next one comes in from the right, and it's going to alternate where it comes in from. So we're going to use CSS transitions to have it come in smoothly. We're going to use JavaScript to basically tell where the trigger point is for the next box to come in. And then we're going to add a specific class to show it. And then if I go back up, it'll remove the class when it hits the trigger point, and it'll all, slide back out. All right, so I think it's really useful. You can use this in a lot of different UIs and different websites. So that's it. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is a very useful but simple project, so we can probably get this done in one video. So let's jump into our project starter here, and for the title, I'm going to just call this scroll animation. And we're going to go down here into the body, and all we really need is a bunch of boxes, which would ultimately contain your website content. We're not going to waste time creating content. We're just going to have a bunch of boxes and then apply the animation to them. I am just going to put an H1 here and say scroll to see the animation. And then under that, we'll have a class of box, and I'm just going to put an H2 with the word content. We'll just copy this down. We'll have a bunch of these. Okay. Now, ultimately, like I said, you would have, these would be cards or just sections of your website, whatever it is that you want to bring in with that slide in animation. So let's go into our style sheet here, and I'm going to add a background color, and let's make that hexadecimal EFEDD6, so kind of a tannish let's see, display flex, justify direction. Okay, so that's good. I'm going to get rid of the height and the overflow hidden, because we do want a scroll bar, obviously. This is a scrolling animation. And then for the H1, I'm going to just set margin to 10 pixels, and then let's create the style for the boxes. So I'm going to use a background color of steel blue. Let's make the text color white. And I'm going to display flex because I just want to align the H2 that's inside to the center, both horizontally and vertically. So display flex, align items, center, and justify content center. And let's set a width of 400 pixels on the box, and let's do a height of 200 pixels. Okay, we want to separate them out, so let's do a margin of 10 pixels, and let's do a border radius. So border radius will do 10 pixels, and let's add a little box shadow. Obviously this stuff isn't needed, but I just want to make it look decent. So we'll do 2 pixels and 4 pixels for the offsets, 5 pixels for the blur, RGBA for the color, which is going to be 000, 0.3 for the alpha value. And then for the animation, we're going to use the transform property with translate X, because that's what we want to do, is move these along the X axis. So initially, let's set box, the class of box transform, and we want to set the translate Y. Translate X, which is horizontal. It's the X axis. Oops, I forgot my semicolon up here. And I'm gonna set this to 2. So 0 is the default. If I set it to 0, there's no change. If I set it to, let's say, 100 pixels and save, you can see it gets moved over 100 pixels, gets moved over to the right. So what I'm gonna do is set this to 200%, which is gonna move it way off the screen to the right. And then what's gonna happen is if we have the class of show, so let's say box with the class of show, then we're going to set the transform and translate translate X to 0, which is the default. So if I go over here and I apply a class of show to this first one, it's going to show because it's in its regular position. The rest of them are still 200% over here. And then what we'll do is we'll have a transition so that when that class gets added, it transitions in smoothly from over here. All right, so we want to add a transition on the transform property. We'll do a 0.4 second duration with an ease effect. Okay, now the way it is now, if we add the JavaScript and we add the scroll functionality and they come in, they're all going to come in from this side. I actually want every other one to come in from different sides. So what we can do is right here, let's take our box class and let's use nth of type, which is a pseudo selector, and we can select all of the even elements, all the even boxes. Okay, so basically, every other one. And what we'll do is, instead of setting the initial transform translate X to 200%, we're going to set it to negative 200%, which is going to put them over here. So all the even ones are now over here, all the odd ones are on this side. Okay, and then when we have them come in, when we dynamically add the class of show, they're going to come in from different sides. All right, and we have to also figure out when we want them to come in as we scroll. So that should do it for the CSS. Actually, I just want to make the H2 a little bigger. So let's say box H2. Set the font size to 45 pixels. And then we'll jump into our JavaScript. And first thing we want to do is bring in our boxes. So let's say const boxes and document.query. We want query selector all because there's more than one. So this will put it into an array or a node list. And then we want to fire off an event when we scroll. So on the window, we're going to add an event listener of scroll. And when that happens, we'll have a function called check boxes, because we want to check the positioning of each box. And a box could be anything. It could be any section of your website or an image or whatever. So we're going to have this function check boxes, and we need to figure out where is the trigger point. Where do we want, when we're scrolling down, where do we want them to start to come in? So we're going to using window dot inner height. In fact, we can just console log that so you can see, and we're going to run checkboxes to begin with anyways right here, so we'll go ahead and run that. And then if I open this up, you'll see 888 is the window height, not counting the console. If I move this console up and I reload, now the height is 406. So we're getting the inner height, and we want the trigger point, so basically where we want, you know, it to scroll in. We're going to want that to be a little less than the inner height, and we can't just use a fixed number because the height could be, you know, different at any point. So what we're going to do is divide this by 5 and then multiply it by 4. So now let me just reload this so you can see the height here is 666. If I save that, now this gives us, this equation here gives us 532. All right, so that's going to be our trigger point. So I'm actually going to put this into a variable. We'll call it trigger bottom. So where in the window do we want it to trigger? So we have that. Now let's go ahead and take our boxes, which we brought in, which is a node list that we can loop through. And we'll say for each box, for each box, let's get the top of the box. And when I say box, I mean the elements here. So const box top. I'm going to set this to the whatever box we're dealing with, because remember we're looping through them. And there's this method called get bounding client rect. So I actually have this, I want to show you this real quick, just so you understand what this does. So this method returns what's called a DOM rect object, and DOM rect is just basically a rectangle, describes the size and position of a rectangle. So it returns that, providing information about the size of an element and its position relative to the viewport. So where in the viewport is it? And there's a bunch of properties that we can use on this. If we go down here, we have the X, Y, width, height, where it is, where the top of it is, where the right, where the bottom, where the left of it is. So we want to see where the top of that particular box is. So we're going to add here dot top. Okay, so that will give us the top value. And then all we need to do after that is see if the top of the box is less than the trigger bottom. If it is, we want to add the class of show. If it's not, if it's more, then we want to remove the class of show. So let's say if the box top is less than the trigger bottom, then let's take that box and let's add a class. So classlist.add of show. Else, then we want to remove it. So box.classlist.remove show. Okay, so now I'm going to go and just remove this show that we added manually. Now notice that it's only showing the first 3 because those are in range. Now when we start to scroll, it's going to fire off an event, and the reason we see these come in initially is because of this right here. If we don't have that, we're not going to see them because this hasn't fired off yet. If I scroll, it does. I mean, if you want that functionality where it doesn't show it until you scroll, that's fine, but usually you would show everything above the fold. So we run that initially first. Then we start to scroll, and as soon as this is true, as soon as the top of the next box is less than the trigger bottom point, which is a little less than the entire height of the viewport, it's going to come in because it adds that class of show. And what that class of show does is sets it to its normal position. Now if it's even, it starts over here, so it comes in from that way. If it's not even, it starts over here and comes in from that way. So every other one comes in from a different direction. And as we scroll up, it's still going to fire off this event, and it's still going to check this. So if this is not true, it'll remove the class. So as we scroll up, you'll see that they'll start to go out. Now, one thing I just noticed is I do have a horizontal scroll bar here, and I don't want that. So in my CSS, I'll just add on to the body here, and I'll say overflow X, because this is the X axis scroll bar. We're going to set that to hidden, so that will get rid of that horizontal scroll bar. All right, so pretty easy, and I mean, a lot of people use jQuery for something like this, or a library like Animate on Scroll. Animate on Scroll is actually a really cool library, and if you want to do some funky stuff, then you can use that. But I mean, if it's just something simple and you're just bringing in elements when you scroll down, this is very lightweight, you know, no extra libraries or anything, and it's really easy to do. So hopefully you guys found this useful, and I'll see you in the next project.